A quiet girl, always sidestepping the eyes of the world, one day receives a mysterious yoga scholarship. No explanation, no sender, just an invitation. What she doesn't know is this: the one who made it possible is the son of the elderly woman she once helped, a reclusive millionaire who's been carrying her image with him since the moment he first saw her, rain-soaked and kind, unaware anyone was watching. Can love begin with a nameless act of kindness and end with two people brave enough to finally be seen exactly as they are? Elira didn't know why that morning. She turned down a different street. It wasn't her habit. She usually walked the path that traced the lake, where birds hid in the trees and the sky shimmered across the water like a balm before the day's noise pressed in. But today, as if her legs had a will of their own, she chose the wide stone path instead, where the pace was faster, the footsteps harder, the eyes more distant. Maybe it was the dream from the night before. A long corridor without an exit, her running, always running. Maybe it was the way her eyes looked in the mirror, no longer red from crying but dulled by the absence of any dream at all. Or maybe it was something simpler, some invisible nudge from life itself, trying gently to call her back. Whatever, the reason that small deviation led her to witness something no one else did. A sharp, dry sound cut through the plaza. A body collapsed, pulled from the world like a thread snapped too suddenly. An old woman, age unclear, only that her hair was nearly white, and her dress a dark, muted color, lay crumpled on the cold bricks. Her bag had rolled away. Elira didn't think. She ran to her, knelt. Her knees hit the ground with a jolt of memory, of another time, another body, not breathing. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her hands trembling as they lifted the woman's shoulders. No one stopped. No one said a word. Just the wheels of carts and the click of heels passing by. The city was too busy to see someone fall. "I still remember the smell of clay on my hands," the woman murmured, squinting at something behind Elira. "Just like my mother's." Elira froze. She had never seen this woman before. A pendant had slipped from the woman's bag, small, made of terracotta, its string worn thin, the face etched with strange, ancient patterns. Elira picked it up, meant to return it. But before she could, a young man appeared, hurried, breathless, as though he'd been looking for her all his life. He bent down, lifted the woman, wrapped a coat around her shoulders. Not a single word, not a glance at Elira, but the woman turned back once, her eyes lingering on Elira for a long, unblinking moment. As if passing something on, Elira watched them disappear into the crowd. It wasn't until they were gone that she realized the pendant was still in her hand. A week later, buried among junk mail and expired promotions in her old inbox, was a message with no subject line. "You have been selected for a full scholarship to the Inner Light yoga class, nominated by an anonymous benefactor. Starts this week." No phone number, no signature, no explanation. Elira nearly deleted it, but her eyes drifted to her desk where the small pendant still lay, as if waiting for an answer of its own. She clicked, "Confirm." The first class was held in a room so still you could hear your own breath. The light was soft, like silk drawn through the air, laced with lavender and oak. Elira stood near the door, fingers curled tight around her bag, feeling like she had stepped into a world meant for people who belonged. She never had. She had learned how to be quiet, how to disappear, how to move through life without leaving a trace. "Welcome," a low voice said. She turned. It was the man from that morning, the one who had lifted the old woman. Now he stood in front of her, dressed in linen, his posture quiet but certain. He didn't look surprised to see her, just held her gaze and didn't let go. He looked at her as if he'd always known. Elira's heart tightened, not from fear, but something deeper, something that had waited a long time to be seen. No one ever taught Elira how to breathe beneath the weight of being watched. No one told her that silence could be loud too, especially when it swelled with the sound of constant self-comparison. The second class began with a slow, unfolding sequence of poses, guided by Kaelin's warm, steady voice. He didn't speak much, but when he did, His words moved with a rhythm, like background music from nowhere in particular, soft enough to make the room itself exhale. Elira rolled out her mat near the window, where sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains and drifted across the floor in shifting patches of gold. She hadn't chosen the spot for the light. It was simply the one place that made her feel the least visible. As Kaylin lowered into a sun salutation, the rest of the class moved in unison, their bodies fluid, spines folding like waves drawn to the shore. Elira, meanwhile, struggled to reach her knees. Each attempt to press her shoulders down sent a sharp line of pain along her back, as if old shames were lodged in her bones, clinging to her from the inside out. Fabric brushing the floor, breath moving evenly, the faint scrape of feet adjusting, and then someone laughed. It was soft, directionless, no clear target, but it came just as Elira wobbled, her arm trembling in a precarious pose, trying to hold herself steady. She dropped to the mat with a thud. Heat flushed her cheeks. No one looked at her, but it was that very not looking that stung the most. Like being a child again, scolded in front of the class, while everyone turned to stare out the window. Like the first time she wore a short skirt, and the boys whispered behind her back, then turned away as if she didn't exist. Her body wasn't made for yoga. She had believed this for a long time. When Kaylin approached, his gaze barely brushed hers, gentle but free of pity. He knelt beside her and said quietly, "If you can't breathe in that pose, breathe in a different one. Yoga's not about becoming someone else. It's about coming closer to yourself." If someone else had said it, she might have dismissed it as just another vague encouragement. But from him, it didn't disappear into the air. It settled somewhere, deep in the bruised, quiet parts of her she thought no one would ever notice. Still, when the class ended, Elira was the last to gather her things. As the others waved goodbye to Kaylin with familiar smiles, she turned away without a word. In the mirrored wall of the studio, she caught a glimpse of herself, smaller, blurred, as if the reflection belonged to someone else. The terracotta pendant remained tucked in her coat pocket, and for the first time Elira found herself wondering, why? Me? Why among so many others was I the one given this? What had I done to deserve it? Something about it didn't feel wrong, but it didn't feel natural either. She left the class with damp palms, a bag that felt oddly heavy, and a quiet, unsettled ache. Not because anyone had pushed her out, but because she herself wasn't sure she belonged in. Maybe you've been like Elira once, standing in a space you thought wasn't meant for you, simply because no one had ever said, "You're enough." In your own quiet, singular way, if you have, take a breath with her. Just one. Elira didn't go to class the next morning. In truth, the decision had settled the night before, quiet and uncertain. She had folded her yoga shirt and left it neatly on the arm of her chair, an act that felt less like a refusal and more like a delay. She told herself that maybe missing just one session would help, that perhaps a little distance would soften the edge of it all, the stares, the unspoken questions, the sinking feeling of being out of place among people who moved like they belonged. But morning passed and evening came, pulling behind it a vague kind of guilt, the kind she didn't have a name for. She thought of Kaylin, his voice, his eyes, when he'd said, "If you can't breathe in that pose, breathe in a different one." His tone hadn't been forceful, not even persuasive, but the words stayed, echoing in her chest every time. She passed the rolled-up mat she hadn't touched. On the second day she skipped class. Elira opened her notebook and wrote just 2 lines. Some places feel like invitations, but turn out to be kindness dressed in passing. Some words feel gentle, but still make you want to run. She folded the notebook and buried it deep in her. Apparently she didn't know what she feared more, that someone might truly see her, or that somehow she had begun to hope they would. 3 days later, just before noon, she walked into the studio to return her membership card. Kaylin happened to be at the front desk, a steaming cup of herbal tea in hand. Elira didn't meet his eyes. She simply placed the card on the counter and said, "I think someone else deserves it more." Kaylin didn't reach for the card. He looked instead at the space between them and asked gently, no anger, no disappointment, "Are you choosing this for yourself or for someone else? She said nothing. The pulse in her wrist throbbed, betraying her calm. Because if it's really for yourself, he continued, then maybe you haven't listened to what you actually want. He didn't wait for an answer, didn't need one. The question wasn't meant to be answered right away, it was meant to echo. Illyra left the studio gripping her bag strap tightly, but this time not from the cold. A few days later, she overheard a conversation. Two girls sat at a cafe near the bus station, the very table Illyra usually favored. That day, they'd gotten there first. She took the table beside them, pulled out her notebook like she always did. But their voices, sharp and careless like pins dropped on hardwood, slipped through the air and found her ears. That girl who fell in class the other day, wearing that oversized shirt. Yeah, she looked like someone who's never worked out in her life, pretending to do yoga. Bet she got in through some kind of sponsorship. She stuck out so much. They didn't know she was sitting right there. Illyra froze. Her fingers clenched around the pen. The words weren't loud, but inside her they rang like shattering glass. Not because of what they said, but because of where they struck. The softest, deepest place. The place where she'd long ago buried memories of being the wrong example of what not to be. She had thought she'd grown out of that, thought she'd built thick enough skin to withstand a few careless comments, but it took so little, just a few words, to awaken the past. Clear as yesterday, Illyra left the cafe without ordering. She walked quickly, holding herself together while something inside her quietly came undone. There are some wounds that don't need fresh harm to resurface. All it takes is a glance, a small, cruel laugh, a sentence that slides perfectly into a crack you thought you'd sealed. And sometimes, the thing that makes us want to disappear isn't the hurt others inflict. It's that we haven't yet forgiven ourselves. That morning, the pottery room held no sound but Illyra's footsteps, slow, quiet, barely enough to stir the dust. Sunlight slanted through the window like a strip of silk, landing across a table mottled with the stains of old glaze. It had been a long time since she'd touched this space, longer still since she'd let herself feel truly alone. People retreat to safety when they're hurt. For Illyra, safety had always been earth. Kilns. The weight of her palms pressing into something still soft, still willing to be shaped. But this morning even this room carried a kind of breathlessness, as though something inside her no longer knew how to return. She began wiping the tabletop, smoothing the cloth cover of the turntable. Everything was so still, the kind of stillness that reminds you silence too can hurt. When her hand reached the old wooden box beneath the shelf, the one that once held broken shards, loose buttons her mother had saved, it gave way with a soft click. But the sound landed in her chest like a knock. Inside, among splinters of broken pencils and discarded tags, was the terracotta necklace. The pendant was small, deep brick red, its fabric cord frayed at the edges. Wedged between its threads was a folded slip of paper, written in handwriting she recognized without needing to guess. "Thank you for helping my mother. Kaylin." Illyra sank to the floor. No chair, no cushion, just her body and the cold tiles beneath it. She opened the note again as if reading it a few more times might change the words. But they didn't change. Only something inside her did. Cracked quietly, then spread. Not violent, but deep and irreversible. She began to cry. Not the kind of crying that begs for comfort, but the kind that arrives when you suddenly realize, all these years, you've lived like you didn't deserve to be seen. She remembered the way her mother once cupped her face after school, after some girls tore her homework because her skirt was too short for her thick legs. Her mother had said, "You only need to be kind, beauty's a smaller thing." But Illyra hadn't believed her. Not then. And if she was honest, never, not fully. Her hands trembled, knocking a ceramic bowl from the shelf. It fell and shattered, the sound echoing through the room. The shards glittered in the sunlight, scattered like a confession. She bent to gather them, as if she could piece back together something in herself. And then, a sudden fear bloomed inside her. If she kept living like this, quiet, closed off, untouched, Would there come a day when she broke, and no one would be there to pick her up? The necklace lay where she'd left it, unbroken, whole. As if the world could fall apart, and kindness would remain. Elira wrapped her fingers around it, pressed it to her chest. For the first time in days, she didn't feel cold, but she didn't feel warm either. She just felt it was real, fragile, tangled, unnamed, but alive. And for once, she didn't want to run from it. Not everyone returns to the place that once hurt them, but Elira did. A week after the ceramic bowl shattered in her hands, she came back to the yoga studio. No grand gesture, no warning. She didn't send an apology or craft a tidy explanation for her disappearance. She simply walked in that early morning, unrolled her worn mat in the familiar corner by the window, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted its edges. A silent kind of sorry. Kalen said nothing when he saw her, just nodded, a quiet tilt of the head, his eyes still and calm like the surface of a lake before wind. And somehow it was that stillness that let her breathe, because sometimes what we need isn't forgiveness, just a space that still has room for us when we come back. The class was unchanged, quiet, steady, the air scented faintly with cedar and oil, breath moving like a living orchestra. Elira tried to focus, but she couldn't help noticing something different in herself. The fear of being watched had lessened. The urge to shrink, to fold inward, wasn't as strong. Midway through, during a short break, she sat with her back against the wall, water bottle in hand, eyes following the shifting sunlight on the wooden floor. A tall, dark-haired woman, somewhere, in middle age, sat beside her. She smiled warmly like they'd known each other before. "You're Elira, right?" the woman asked, her voice low, gentle. Elira nodded, caught a little off guard. "Yes, I'm the one who left, and came back. That's all right. Everyone here's come back from somewhere." Then the woman tilted her head, lowered her voice even more, like sharing a secret. "Do you know who Kalen is?" Elira froze. A strange current climbed her spine. She shook her head. "You helped his mother that day," the woman said. "The woman who fell, I saw it from a distance, couldn't get there in time. But I saw you. You were the only one who stopped." Elira went still. Her grip tightened around the bottle. Her heart pounded loud enough she could hear it. The woman's voice softened again, but with a weight to it now, something that cut through the moment with clarity. "Kalen's not just a yoga instructor. He's the son of Isolde Rowe. She used to run 3 startups before she chose to disappear from that world. Kalen turned down every offer to return to finance. He chose this path instead, and you're the first person he's ever nominated for a full, lifetime scholarship." Elira couldn't breathe for a moment, not because of who Kalen was, but because of the quiet depth behind a kindness she'd never believed was meant for her. "He didn't do it out of pity," the woman added, as if reading her thoughts. "He did it out of gratitude. And it for a reason I think you already sense." The class ended. Students filtered out one by one. Elira lingered near the doorway, watching as Kalen folded up the mats, head bowed, hair falling gently. With each breath, she stepped forward, stopping a few paces away. "I don't know what I did," she said, "that someone would remember me." Kalen looked up. He met her gaze, and this time he didn't look at her as someone grateful. He looked at her as someone who had cherished something for a long time, but chosen silence over possession. "You don't have to do anything to be remembered," he said. "If you've ever been kind to someone, truly kind that never disappears." Elira didn't answer, but for the first time she smiled. Not a small, cautious smile. A real one. Wide enough to soften her whole face. True, enough to bring tears to her eyes, and for a moment the whole room seemed to glow, even as the light outside was fading. That afternoon after class, Elira didn't leave right away. She lingered in the studio using the excuse of straightening a few misaligned mats, wiping up faint streaks of water on the floor. But her hands moved in habitual motions. What her heart was doing was waiting. Kalen didn't rush either. He stood by the window looking out at the small courtyard where the bamboo swayed in the wind. The sky held neither sun nor rain, just that soft, sifted light, as if memory itself had been ground into dust and scattered over everything. "Elira?" She looked up. Not surprised, but not entirely steady either. "I think it's time I said it out loud," Kaylin said. "Direct, without pretense, no mask between them now. It was me. I was the one who nominated you for the scholarship. The one behind all of it." Her heart skipped, then thudded against her chest. But she said nothing. She just looked at him, as though trying to see through a fogged window. Close, and yet somehow still distant. "Why?" The words slipped out, quiet but sharp like the edge of paper against skin. "Because I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice slow, grounded. "Not just for helping my mother, but for how you did it, with no hesitation, without waiting. To be seen." Elira gave a small, wry smile. "So your way of thanking someone is setting them up with an invisible favor?" "It wasn't a favor," Kaylin replied, his gaze steady. "It was an opening. For me, to get closer to someone I admired before I even knew her name." The air between them thickened, like time had drawn in a breath and held it. Elira stepped back, her eyes glossed, but unspilled. "You didn't have to do that. I'm not someone special, and I definitely don't want to become someone in someone else's imagination." Kaylin didn't interrupt. He let her speak all the way through. Let her rebuild the walls she'd learned to raise for protection. "You don't understand," she said. "It's taken me years to accept that I'm not someone people choose. And now you're here, making me think maybe I could be something I never believed I was." As the words left her, they left an echo behind, one only the speaker could hear. A sound from the ribcage, a truth long buried, surfacing. Kaylin stepped closer. Not quickly. Not to corner. Just to be near. "You think I'm in love with someone perfect?" Elira looked up. His eyes, soft as velvet but clear as glass, held her. "I don't love because someone is perfect," he said. "I love because I saw someone strong when no one else was looking. Because she knew how to move quietly through the world and still chose to be kind. Because she didn't need an audience to lift someone else up." Her chest loosened, like the last hidden clasp had finally come undone. His words didn't feel like pity. They felt like recognition. Like light gently illuminating the parts she thought no one could see. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was warm. Like someone placing a hand gently over a wound, and you realizing, yes, you still feel something there. She didn't speak, didn't step closer, but for the first time, she didn't step away. Kaylin didn't press. He didn't need an answer. That space, that hour, that look, they were enough to know. A door inside Elira had opened, not wide, but honestly. Maybe you've stood at that threshold too. That place between protecting your quiet and risking your heart. If someone once said something that stilled you, not because they asked for anything, but because they saw you, leave a comment. And if this story touched something in you, tap subscribe, so we can keep telling each other the things the heart always longs to hear, slowly, deeply, gently. That morning, Elira woke earlier than usual. Not for a promise, not for a plan. She simply wanted to feel the first light of day touch her face before it touched anything else. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, hands still damp from washing. The glass was fogged with steam, and for a moment her reflection was just a blur in the mist. But it was the first time she didn't rush to wipe it away. As the mirror slowly cleared and her features came into focus, she noticed something unexpected. Not the familiar contours or imperfect skin, but the look in her eyes. There was something in it that felt worn, yes, but peaceful too. As if somehow she'd stopped fighting herself. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to fix anything. No makeup, no masks, no softening, reshaping, hiding. She just stood there and let herself be seen. That afternoon, after class, Elira walked over to where Kaylin was putting away a few old meditation books, his fingers dusted with paper ash. "Elira," he said, "a greeting, nothing more. No defenses now. Would you have tea with me?" she asked. No. Circling. No hiding the tremble in her chest. Just a simple invitation, enough to slow the world down. Kaylin smiled. Not the smile of someone being invited, but of someone who'd been waiting longer than she realized. They sat at the small tea shop behind the studio, where the wooden chairs were worn smooth, and each cup was set carefully on handmade ceramic saucers. The place was quiet, like a prelude left unfinished. Even the server didn't ask many questions, as if they understood that some conversations begin best in silence, long before they find their shape in words. "You always choose unglazed ceramics here?" Elira asked, running her fingers along the clay surface of her cup. "Because they're imperfect," Kaylin said. "Each one has its own fracture, like how we carry the marks of who we were." Elira nodded. Her gaze traced a faint crack along the rim of the cup, and she didn't see it as a flaw. "There was a time," she said, "when I thought I had to fix everything, my walk, my voice, my laugh, to not bother anyone, to fit into what people thought I should be, but it turns out the part they remember is the one I tried hardest to hide." Kaylin didn't respond. He just listened. And in that silence, something settled. Something soft and wide, like a door slowly opening. Between cooling cups of tea, between stories told in scattered pieces, between two people no longer bound by debt or damage, something began. Not out of obligation, not out of repair, but from something deeply real. They had seen each other, and this time no one looked away. There was no background music, no spotlight, just an ordinary afternoon, two people facing each other, and the unfamiliar tender feeling that for once there was no need to rush. The final class closed with a chime that lingered longer than usual, like a gentle goodbye for all the words left unsaid. The room exhaled the warmth of the day, slow and tender, as if even the walls understood that every beautiful moment eventually asks to be let go. Elira rolled up her mat with care, not rushed, not reluctant, just deliberate enough to let the rhythm of this space stay with her a little longer. Across the room, Kaylin was stacking books, but this time, there was no distance left between them that needed to be filled with words. They left the studio together, not planned, not spoken, just two people walking in the same direction. The sky had settled into the color of honeyed. Tea and the late sunlight painted the street in a warm gold, as if it had spilled from someone's forgotten dream. The little tea shop behind the studio welcomed them with a familiar whisper of mint and the clink of cups. 2 mugs arrived without being ordered. The server simply nodded, as though they'd watched this whole quiet journey unfold and knew this moment had been waiting. Kaylin glanced at his phone. The screen's light caught the edge of his face, thoughtful and still, full of words not yet spoken. "An old contact reached out," he said softly. "They need someone steady to lead the old team again. Creative director. Big salary. Big everything." Elira didn't reply right away. She blew gently on her tea, fingers resting on the rim like she was holding the edge of a moment not quite ready to fall quiet. "Will you go?" He nodded, but his eyes moved slower than his head. "Elira?" He paused as if asking something he maybe shouldn't. "If I go, will you wait for me?" It wasn't a proposal, not quite hope, more like a final line. Spoken. Before letting go of something you're afraid you may never find again, Elira looked at him, long and clearly. There was no anger in her eyes, no pleading, no fragility, only truth. The kind that comes from having once clung too tightly to the wrong things, and finally learning to let go with grace. "I won't wait," she said, her hand grazing the terracotta pendant resting near her heart. "I used to wait. For people to choose me, for myself to become enough. But waiting, it's another way of holding on to what we can't control. I don't want to live like that anymore." She paused, then smiled, a smile unscarred, untethered. "But if it's meant, we'll meet again, maybe at another tea shop, maybe in a place where neither of us needs to ask who's waiting." Kaylin didn't respond, but his eyes, once again, looked at her the way they had that first day in class, gently, gratefully, and with a trace of letting go. When he stood, Elira didn't stop him. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. She simply watched, letting each of his steps become another reason she could stand steadier on her own. Later, She walked past the narrow alley leading to the studio, but didn't turn in. Instead, she kept going, stopping in front of a weathered wooden door with a hand-painted sign, "Clay and Quiet, where stillness takes shape." She stepped inside. The room was dusted with time. The potter's wheel sat untouched, as if waiting for someone to wake it. Elira wiped the first layer of dust away, placed the terracotta pendant beside the table, and sat down. Her hands touched the clay, not timid now, not shying from its roughness or the way it clung beneath her nails. The earth was soft, like a second chance, and Elira smiled. This time she didn't make a thing. She simply worked the clay, like someone coaxing a heart back to rhythm after it had once fallen out of sync. If you've stayed with Elira until this moment, thank you for listening to a story that whispered more than it shouted. If you've seen pieces of yourself in her, or simply believe that love sometimes means letting go, share this video and follow the channel, so we can keep telling each other these quiet, tender stories that remind us we are never truly alone. Thank you for being here softly all along. A quiet girl, invisible most of her life, finds a lost dog on a rainy evening, and soon discovers it belongs to a reclusive millionaire the world hasn't seen in years. What she doesn't know is that the dog is the last thread tying him to his late wife. Some wounds don't need fixing, only a quiet hand, and someone who stays long enough to let the healing begin. Can someone who's never dared to love find the courage to be loved? The dog appeared without a sound. No footsteps, no bark, no warning. It was simply there, soaked through, trembling, with eyes as black and bottomless as the hollowed-out dark of a nameless nightmare. Elira Wynne didn't hear it arrive, but she felt it, like the way you just know someone is standing behind you even before you turn. A quiet presence, urgent in its stillness, like a question that hadn't yet found the words to be asked. She startled. Her first instinct was to step back. She was afraid of dogs. The smell of wet fur, their unpredictability, the way they sometimes offered affection without invitation, it all made her feel unmoored. But it wasn't fear that rooted her in place. It was the dog's eyes. They didn't plead, didn't brighten, didn't brace for harm. They simply looked at her, eyes so used to disappointment they no longer expected anything at all. It was raining. Not a storm, just a persistent, weary drizzle, as if the sky itself was too tired to stop. The drops slanted through the dull amber light of the bus stop, ticking against the awning like the steady knock of old memories. Elira stood beneath it, arms wrapped around a canvas bag of borrowed library books. One of them was about dog breeds. She'd never meant to read it. The dog lay down beneath the bench. No apology, no explanation, no begging. Just lay down, as if this was the last place left to go and it had already made peace with being turned away. And that, oddly, was what caught in her chest. Not pity, but recognition. Sometimes people aren't looking for shelter. Just a place where, if they disappeared, no one would think to ask why. A chill crawled down her spine as she crouched. She didn't want to see clearly, but she couldn't help herself. Around its neck, a metal tag hung from a tarnished collar, swaying slightly as it tapped the concrete floor with a small, dry clink. She brushed aside the matted, dirty fur. Etched faintly into the worn metal were 3 nearly invisible words. "Wait for me." She read them again and again. Her throat tightened, not from emotion exactly, but from something older. A memory surfacing like smoke from a candle burned in an empty room. Wait for me. Who was waiting? Or who had never come back? A bus horn cut through the hush. Headlights flared, flooding the little station in white. The doors hissed open. The driver leaned out, questioning her with his eyes. Elira didn't move. Her heart knocked, hard against her ribs. It felt like something ancient was stirring inside her. Something locked away a long time ago. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at the rain. She didn't realize what she was doing until she saw her own hands, shaking slightly, undoing the wool scarf from her neck and gently wrapping it around the creature's shivering body. It didn't flinch, just slowly closed its eyes as if this was what it had been waiting for, in another world, in another life. Elira lifted it into her arms. It was heavier than she expected. Her steps faltered. Damp and mud clung to her coat. Everything was messy, wet, unlike her. The bus door remained open. The light spilled out, but she didn't step in. "Wait for me," the words echoed, soft and insistent, as she turned away from the bus and walked into the rain. Elira's apartment was on the 3rd floor, tucked at the end of a narrow hallway that curved slightly. Like a turn she took every day without ever really seeing it. She rarely opened the windows. She didn't keep plants. She never left. The lights on in a room for too long, those things to her felt like asking for permission to exist, and she'd never quite believed she deserved that. By the time she stepped inside, her hands were numb with cold and damp. The dog still lay cradled in her arms, lighter now, worn out by the rain, but its breathing remained fragile and rhythmic, like it had learned to inhale just enough to keep from fading altogether. She laid it down on an old bath towel, one she had once bought to dust her books, not to welcome a life. She had never imagined doing something like this. Rummaging through a drawer, Elira found a carton of oat milk and the small bowl she used when eating cereal alone. She poured in some warm water and nudged the bowl closer. The dog didn't lift its head, just half opened its eyes, enough to let her know it was still there. She changed clothes, hung her wet scarf on the door hook, and sat down on the floor, back against the wall. The room was hushed, just the ticking of the clock and the poor breath of two strangers sharing space. A soft sound broke the quiet, a notebook slipping from her canvas bag. She picked it up, pausing as her fingers brushed the dampened first page. The ink had bled slightly, but one line was still legible. "One day I'll say it, just once." Elira had written that sentence 4 years ago. She used to jot down things that deserved to be said, little conversations she'd imagined, but never voiced. Feelings no one ever asked about, so she stopped offering them. The notebook had slowly become a vault, for the pieces of herself no one had ever reached. She glanced at the dog, now asleep. Its eyes were closed, but its legs were still curled tight as though bracing for a dream that might betray it. A memory stirred, clear and immediate, like it had just happened that afternoon. She was 10. It was her sister's birthday party. Elira had stood quietly in a corner, clutching a small gift of her own. A pencil sketch she'd drawn, folded neatly into an envelope. No one asked about it. No one seemed to notice she was there. When the party ended, she slipped the envelope into the pile of brightly wrapped presents. The next day she found it by the trash. Unopened, she never drew again. Elira didn't know why she remembered that now. Maybe it was the look in the dog's eyes, the look of something used, to not being chosen, not being kept, not being seen as enough to love. She reached out, gently touching the damp fur on its neck. The dog didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. Just a quiet touch, enough for them both to know they weren't entirely alone anymore. The night passed slowly, as if time itself had decided to sit down beside them. Elira didn't put on any music. She didn't need to. Everything worth hearing was already there. The breathing, the memories, and something quietly beginning to bloom without a name yet. Before bed, she draped a thin blanket over the dog. On the wooden table beside her bed, the notebook lay, open, the purple ink still drying. "One day I'll say it, just once," Elira smiled for the first time in a month. Not because someone had finally listened, but because she was learning how to speak again, in the smallest of ways. Have you ever written down something you couldn't bring yourself to say aloud? Maybe this story is stirring a part of you once left behind. Try leaving it in a little note. Who knows, it might just be the beginning of something else. Mornings in the city weren't peaceful, just noisy in a way that had been scheduled into order. Footsteps, car horns, the hiss and slam of coffee shop doors. But in Elira's 3rd-floor apartment, that morning moved slower, more hesitant, as if time itself was waiting for something to happen before it could begin again. The dog, now more alert, lifted its head when Elira changed out the damp towel and replaced the water. It didn't bark. Still that uncanny silence. But something had shifted in its eyes, As if it now remembered her face in a way that didn't require names, Elira stood for a long moment before deciding to take it to the vet. She didn't have much money, but she couldn't keep it like this, half belonging, half lost. When the technician scanned the chip beneath its scruff, a name appeared on the screen. Calum Stroud. Elira froze. The name was familiar. Not in the way of acquaintances, but in the way of headlines glanced at and forgotten. Reclusive young millionaire. Estate left empty after wife's death. Absent from public view for over 3 years. She read the name again, then looked at the dog, and suddenly its silence carried a different weight, as if it wasn't just a stray, but the last living witness to a story no one had ever finished telling. She left the clinic with the printed address. That afternoon she sat in the corner of a small cafe, hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea, just wondering whether she should go. She wasn't someone who knocked on doors. She certainly wasn't someone who appeared, uninvited in the lives of others, but something urged her forward. Not curiosity exactly, but a sense that if she didn't return the dog, she was holding on to a memory that didn't belong to her. The road to Calum's estate was long and narrow, lined with old trees leaning over like weary sentinels. The iron gate wasn't locked, just left ajar. As she stepped through, Elira felt as though even the air here remembered loss. She rang the bell. No answer. She was about to turn away when she heard footsteps, soft, as if the person approaching wasn't sure they wanted to meet whoever was on the other side. The door creaked open. Calum Stroud stood there, not as the papers had described. Him, not sharp or cold. Just a man with shadows under his eyes, shoulders slightly caved, and a gaze that looked not at her but through her, as if asking something of himself, not her. He didn't say, "I'm Calum." He didn't say, "Can I help you?" He looked at the dog, then at her. "Where did you find her?" he asked. His voice was low, not harsh, just empty. "At a bus stop," Elira said, her hand tightening unconsciously around her bag strap. Calum crouched, touching the dog's head gently. It didn't bark, just stepped forward, pressing its forehead lightly against his leg. Not a gesture of apology, but one of remembrance. "Thank you," he whispered. Just that. But within the quiet timbre of his voice lay the weight of a gratitude too long unspoken, too displaced to know where to land. Elira nodded. She hadn't come for more. She turned to leave, but after only a few steps she heard the door open wider behind her. "Her name is Nira," he said, not looking at her. "My wife named her—" Elira paused, just for a heartbeat. But it was enough for something to shift in the air between them. Not an invitation, not yet, but the beginning of one. She didn't look back, but all the way home, she carried that name with her. Nira, and that gaze, deep as a chasm, and wet, as if there was still a storm inside him that hadn't yet run out of rain. The next day the rain was gone, but the wind had turned sharp, as if the sky emptied of water was trying to return it all in frost-bitten breath. Elira stood once more before the wrought-iron gate. In her hand, the cleaned metal collar shimmered faintly in the slanted light of late afternoon. "Wait for me." The inscription now gleamed as though it had been waiting to be read properly. In her bag, the washed and neatly folded wool scarf rested like a quiet offering. She didn't know exactly why she'd come back, only that after their last meeting, she hadn't slept. Not because of the dog, but because of Calum's voice, the way he had said thank you, not out of politeness, not from habit, but like someone remembering how to speak a word long forgotten. And his eyes that carried an emptiness too familiar to ignore, too much like her own. When Calum opened the door, he didn't look at her. His gaze went straight to what she held, the collar. He reached out without a word, but when his fingers brushed hers, he didn't pull back right away. The contact was brief, barely there, but Elira felt it, a quiet, invisible thread strung between them. "I thought I'd thrown it out," he said softly, still not meeting. Her eyes, Elira had no answer. The air between them thickened in the silence. Calum turned and walked back inside. She assumed that was it, that he'd closed the door and let it all vanish behind him. But instead of the sound of a lock came the sound of footsteps returning. This time. He held a small wooden box, its paint chipped, the lid marked with a fine, splintered crack like something long buried in memory. He opened it. Inside lay a deflated rubber ball, a handkerchief stitched with the letter N, and a faded photo of a woman laughing as she cradled the dog, her gaze full of a tenderness Elira had never been looked at with. "She died 3 years ago," Calum said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "A car accident. Nira was the last piece of her I had. After that, I couldn't touch her. Couldn't look, couldn't stand to hear her footsteps in the house. But I couldn't throw everything away either. I kept this, to remind myself not to forget." He closed the box and held it out toward her. "Take it. And Nira, I think she needs someone new." Elira gripped her bag tightly, stunned. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to be mistaken for wind. "Is it because it hurts too much to keep her, or because you're afraid it means you still love?" The question wasn't meant to provoke. It had simply been waiting too long to be spoken, but Calum didn't get angry. He just went quiet. So quiet that even the draft slipping through the door sounded like a sigh. "There are things you can't hold on to," he said at last. "But you can't let them go either. They just exist somewhere in between." Elira took the box from him. Her hands trembled, not from cold. Just for a moment it felt like she was carrying someone else's grief. A memory that had never been voiced, never shared, now placed gently in her keeping, simply because she had once looked at a soul the way it remembered being seen. She turned to leave. Nira, waiting in the car, perked up at the sight of her. No leash was needed. She followed Elira quietly, without a bark, without hesitation, as if she'd already chosen, and required no reason. That night, Elira dreamed, but not the usual fragments and static. She dreamed of Calum, standing in a doorway lit with warm gold light. Nira lay at his feet, calm and unbroken, as if time had rewound to a moment untouched by loss. In the dream, he said something, but she couldn't quite hear it. She only saw his lips shape a name, perhaps his wife's, perhaps something. He hadn't dared call out in a long time, hope. When Elira woke, her chest felt lighter, not entirely, just enough to know she'd started to move. That afternoon, the wind carried the faint scent of smoke, the kind that lingers only when someone has just rekindled a fire long thought dead. Elira walked the gravel path toward Calum's estate, her hand gently curled around a linen-wrapped bundle, the metal collar cleaned and cool, its inscription glinting beneath the slanting light of a fading sun. "Wait for me." She hadn't planned on seeing him again so soon. But something had stirred in her since the night before, a quiet restlessness, like a part of her recently awakened after sleeping too long. She only meant to leave the collar at his door. No need to speak, no need to stay, just the simple act of returning a memory to its rightful place. But as she placed the bundle on the cold stone step and began to pull her hand away, the wooden door opened, soundless, as though it had always been slightly ajar, waiting only for her to arrive at the right moment. Calum stood there. The late light brushed his shoulders in a soft gold, warming nothing, but making him seem a little less like winter. His gaze dropped to the parcel in her hand, then rose to meet hers. There was no surprise, no trace of irritation, only a question unspoken and suspended in his eyes. "Why did you come back?" Elira didn't answer. She simply held out the bundle. He took it from her as if it might break. Then, silently, he stepped back and tilted the door open wider, a wordless invitation. Inside, the house was not what she'd imagined, not cold, not dark, but a stillness that had clearly been chosen, like every object in the space had agreed to speak only in whispers. Unframed paintings leaned gently against the wall. A bookshelf sagged under the weight of years. A piano sat beneath a sheer cloth. A wool blanket rested half-folded on the couch, like someone had meant to put it away, but changed their mind, not perfect, but lived in, not cold, just sad. They sat across from each other in the living room, a dark wood table between them. On it, a small photograph tilted slightly toward the light, a woman with sunlit, windswept hair laughing beside Neera. Alira recognized her even before she truly saw her. She didn't know the woman's name, but she knew that look, that gaze that had appeared once in a dream she had no right to call her own. Kylam reached out and touched the frame, then pulled his hand back. "She died in the fall," he said, voice uneven but steady. The car rolled, slick roads. They said, they think she turned around to call for Neera. They found paw prints leading away from the crash, then circling back. Alira held her breath. She was holding Neera. When they found them, Neera was still alive, but her eyes, they were hollow, like she'd gone with her part way, then came back. He paused, fingers tapping lightly against the table, like trying to keep himself tethered. After that, I couldn't bear the sound of her paws in the house. Couldn't look at her. Every time I saw her standing in the kitchen, bending down to stroke her fur. I tried to give Neera away more than once, but she always found her way back. This time, she didn't." He looked at Alira then. No tears, but something had shifted in him. A door cracked open, pain no longer barricaded but breathing. "I thought I'd lost her," he said. "Not Neera, but the part of her that still lived in me." Alira didn't know when her tears had started. Maybe when he spoke of Neera's eyes, maybe when his voice broke just slightly. She didn't speak, just reached across the table, laid her hand gently on the back of his. A small gesture, barely a touch, but the moment her skin met his, she felt it, something uncoiling, faint and soft, like a fist that had stayed clenched too long, finally learning how to open. They sat like that in a nameless space, neither of them speaking, but the room felt different, as if it too had exhaled, as if something heavy had been set down and no longer needed to be carried. When Alira stood to leave, Kylam called after her, for the first time, using her name, Alira. She turned. In his eyes was something not quite hope, but no longer despair. "Neera chose you," he said. "I think there's a reason for that." Alira gave a small nod, then stepped back through the door, which eased shut behind her. But in her chest, something had opened, like the first warmth of sunlight after too long a winter. Not love, not yet, but certainly something beginning with tenderness. Since that conversation, neither of them reached out, but Alira kept coming. She didn't know if it was choice or instinct, only that each Sunday morning she would brew peppermint tea, wrap crisp biscuits in brown waxed paper, and walk Neera back along the winding stone path lined with trees bent like memory itself, trying in its quiet way to shelter something very old. Kylam never asked why she came. He simply opened the door when he heard her familiar steps, and stepped out as if he'd been waiting, not necessarily for her, but perhaps for the stillness she carried with her, the kind he'd forgotten how to hold on his own. The house began to change, not with new paint or furniture, but in the way light began to return through windows no longer kept shut. The scent of baked goods found its way into the old bookcases. The clink of dishes, sometimes the soft thump of Neera's tail, sometimes the hush of Alira's laugh, wove itself into the rooms, creating a new rhythm of life. Fragile, yes, but unmistakably real. Anyone who stepped inside would feel something had begun to live again. Alira never thought too hard about why she brought the cookies. Maybe because his kitchen felt too quiet. Or maybe because she missed the scent of her mother's kitchen, even though she could no longer remember her mother's face clearly. But when Kylam lifted the lid on the tin of gingerbread leaves, she'd carefully shaped, and his eyes lingered on the delicate arcs she'd traced into each one. She knew some gestures didn't need explanation. Their meaning carried itself. "Neera still wants to stay with me," she said one morning, her voice soft enough that if he didn't hear it, she could pretend she hadn't spoken. "I don't think I'm the right person, but I think she thinks I am." Kylam looked up. The porch light caught his eyes, just so, brightening them. And what he said next carried more warmth than any glance ever could. "Maybe it's because you don't think you're the right person," he said. that you are exactly who she needs." The words landed with unexpected force. Elira curled her fingers into her palm beneath the table. She had spent her whole life trying not to take up space, avoiding the room, the conversation, the moment. But now, something had chosen her, a creature who had stayed, a man who had begun slowly to open a door. And for the first time, she didn't step away when she realized she was being seen. Calum reached for another cookie, then paused. Instead of taking it, his fingers rested lightly on her hand. Not to hold, not to gesture, just to touch, a quiet contact that spoke the kind of truth no one had yet said aloud. "You remind me," he murmured, "that kindness still exists." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't something that asked for a response. It was simply said, and, because it was real, it trembled with weight. Elira didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. And in that moment, something was affirmed, not with words, but with presence. That day, she didn't bring Nira home. Calum knelt beside her, for the first time in 3 years, and whispered something into her ear, as if naming a piece of the past he was no longer afraid to touch. As Elira stepped outside, ready to leave, Calum followed. In his hands, a small cloth bag. Inside, a few old books, a couple of new toys for Nira, and a folded note. He didn't say a word, just placed it in hers. When she opened it later, the first line read, "Nira is still yours, if you still choose her." Elira smiled. A rare smile, a true one. A smile that told her she didn't need to choose anything anymore. What had chosen her was already there, standing quietly behind her. From that moment on, Nira lived with Elira. But each weekend she returned to the estate. Some bonds don't require ties to remain whole. They simply know their way home. Maybe people are like that too. Maybe all it takes is one gentle touch to know we are no longer lost. If you've ever met someone who made you believe kindness still exists, tell us in the comments below. And if this story reached somewhere inside you, don't forget to follow our channel. There are many more moments waiting to be heard, and many more chances for you to be heard too. That afternoon, the sunlight wasn't golden, but it was enough to warm whatever it touched. A soft wind slipped through the garden behind the estate, where the lavender had begun to bloom early, not in bursts of brilliance, but in quiet, modest sprigs edging the grass, like a presence that knew how to make room. Elira sat on a wooden bench, a book open on her knees, though her eyes weren't reading. Nira lay curled at her feet, breathing steadily, her coat catching the light in soft, gleaming waves. Across the garden, Calum bent low, trimming a hedge. His sleeves were rolled up, his movements patient to the point of reverence, as if each snip was a way of keeping rhythm with something larger than himself. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't hollow but full, like music without notes, still somehow audible. This was the first time Elira had seen Calum outside the quiet rooms and shadowed eyes. In the sun, he looked ordinary. Not in the dull sense, but peaceful, in the way of someone who had survived grief and no longer needed to control everything to feel safe. He no longer kept Nira for himself. He didn't hold on to Elira either, but he tended to this small garden as if it were a kind of refuge, a place where no one had to explain why they stayed. A sparrow fluttered down near the lavender. Elira turned, just as Calum looked up. Their eyes met, softly, briefly, not a gaze that searched or claimed, but simply saw. The kind of look some people spend their whole lives waiting for, not to be wanted, not to be fixed, just to be witnessed and quietly accepted. When Calum came over and placed the shears on the stone table beside her, he didn't ask if she was hungry. He just said, "I was thinking of cooking something simple tonight, and would you like to stay?" Elira smiled, small but sure. A nod that felt like winking to a version of herself she'd only just begun to trust. Dinner was quiet in the little kitchen with the window looking out to the garden. The light was soft, The air carried the scent of buttered asparagus, and the rhythmic tap of knife against board filled the space with something unremarkable and, because of that, deeply tender. For Calum, it was the first time in nearly 4 years he had cooked for someone other than himself. For Elira, it was the first time in longer than she could remember that a meal felt like something to look forward to, not because of the food, but because of the person sharing it. They didn't talk much, but between the silences something quietly settled. In the scrape of cutlery, in Neera's snuffling breaths beneath the table, in the unspoken glances that held more presence than any conversation. When it was time for her to go, Calum walked her to the gate. And just as she was about to step, "Beyond the threshold," he said, gently, as if he wasn't sure whether he was asking or simply thinking aloud, "What do you think?" "This place is for us." Elira paused, then turned, narrowing her eyes against the light lining the garden path. "It's a breath," she said. "Like when you read a line that's just too good, and you have to stop, just for a second, to feel it all the way through." Calum gave a quiet nod. He didn't reply, but this time, when the gate closed behind her, it didn't feel like leaving. It felt like a pause, between two meetings yet to be named. That night the wind shifted. The season hadn't quite turned, but the change was unmistakable. Grass blades along the balcony bowed gently, as if they too needed soft hands at the end of a long day. Elira came home in a light coat, hair loose across her shoulders, one hand gripping her bag, the other holding Neera's leash. The dog walked beside her like a shadow, unpulled, uncalled, the same way she and Calum now walked together, no promises, but a shared rhythm of breath. The apartment looked the same as always, small, familiar, unchanged. Yet tonight, when she turned on the light, the room felt warmer. Maybe it was the afterglow of afternoons at the estate. Or maybe it was simply that her hands had learned warmth again, with Neera always near. She hung up her coat, poured a glass of water, then reached into her bag for the book she'd forgotten the day before. A slip of paper fluttered out, light as air, as if it carried no weight at all. Elira froze, folded into thirds, its edges soft with hesitation, like it had been put away, then taken back out more than once. She opened it slowly, careful not to let the sound of unfolding disturb whatever. Fragile thing had just arrived. Handwritten, neat, unadorned. "Some people save lives. You saved something I thought was already gone." Beneath it, smaller. "If you don't hate mint tea, come by this Saturday. Just tea. Just quiet. No name. None needed." Elira sat at the table, her fingers tightened around the note. Then, loosened, in the soft pool of lamplight, she glanced toward Neera, curled by the door, her collar now repurposed, the tag fashioned into a keychain that hung from Elira's backpack. "Wait for me" no longer read like a plea. It read like a memory, a reminder that someone had once been waited for, and could be again. She checked the clock. Thursday. Still one more day to think. Elira brought the note to her chest, not like someone clutching a love letter, but like someone trying to see if her heart beat differently now. Then she folded it again and placed it on the table. No reply. No message sent back. She simply stood and made herself a cup of mint tea. The scent spread gently through the room, not conjuring Calum nor any imagined romance, but her, herself. The version of Elira who could now stand in the light, of a fully lit room no longer hiding in shadow. A woman who had once moved so quietly she forgot the sound of her own steps, now sitting in stillness, but not feeling alone. She didn't decide she would go, but she didn't say she wouldn't. Some questions are meant to be answered not with certainty, but with a quiet pause, and a door just slightly open. "You're still here, reading these last few lines. Thank you for letting this story live inside you for a little while. If Elira's quiet invitation stirred something in you, send this to someone who might need a soft yes, without pressure. And if you believe gentleness deserves to be shared, like a whispered gift, tap like and pass this story along, because sometimes the smallest things can be everything to someone.